It was a crisp autumn night when Joe Delaney took the wheel of his Freightliner for what was supposed to be a routine haul through the remote stretches of Wyoming. The kind of night where the moon hangs low, casting a silver veil over the land, and the only thing that breaks the silence is the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Joe had driven this route countless times, and the only thing that had ever unnerved him was the isolation. But that night, the isolation took on a whole new meaning. He had just crossed the Wyoming border and entered a stretch of highway known for its desolate beauty. The landscape was a vast expanse of rolling hills and sparse vegetation, a place where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Joe had just passed a dilapidated sign that read, "Welcome to Blackwood," when the radio went dead. Static replaced the familiar voices and Joe frowned, reaching for the dial. Nothing. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. He was about to pull over and check the connections when the first set of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck, smaller than his own, seemed to be barreling down the road toward him at an alarming speed. Joe squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the details of the other vehicle. It was an old model, with rust creeping up the sides and a dented grille. As it got closer, he noticed something odd. The truck was swerving erratically, as though the driver was struggling to keep it on the road. Just as the truck was about to pass, its headlights flickered and went out, plunging the highway into darkness. Joe's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, bringing his Freightliner to a screeching halt. The other truck had disappeared into the night, leaving only a cloud of dust in its wake. Joe sat in stunned silence, the only sound the steady thrum of his own engine. He had heard tales of strange occurrences in these parts, truckers who'd seen things they couldn't explain, but he had always dismissed them as tall tales. Shaking off the unease, Joe checked the radio again. It was still dead. He decided to continue driving, hoping to catch a signal further down the road. An hour later, with the moon riding high in the sky, Joe saw the flickering lights of a small diner off the side of the highway. He pulled in, hoping to get some information or at least use a payphone to call for assistance. The diner, named Gertie's Grub, was a quaint, old-fashioned place with a neon sign that buzzed intermittently. Inside, the lights were dim, and the air was thick with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The counter was empty except for a middle-aged woman with graying hair, who looked up from behind the counter with a wary expression. "Evening," Joe said, taking a seat at the counter. "I'm having some trouble with my radio and thought I'd see if I could get some help." The woman's eyes flickered to the window, where the darkness seemed to press against the glass like an oppressive force. "Trouble, huh?" she said, her voice low and gravelly. "What kind of trouble?" "Just static," Joe replied, glancing at the old jukebox in the corner. "It's been going on since I left Blackwood." The woman stiffened. "You came from Blackwood?" Her tone was almost accusatory. Joe nodded. "Yeah, just passing through." She sighed and walked over to a small shelf where she picked up a dusty book. "You might want to read this," she said, sliding the book across the counter. The cover was plain, with no title, only a faded illustration of a lonely stretch of highway. "It's not much, but it might explain things." Joe flipped through the pages, which were filled with handwritten notes and eerie sketches. It was a collection of local legends and trucker stories, each one more chilling than the last. One story, in particular, caught his eye. It was about a phantom trucker who appeared out of nowhere, always at the edge of the darkness, and who was said to be seeking something that had been lost long ago. The woman watched him with a mixture of pity and concern. "You should be careful," she said quietly. "Some roads aren't meant to be traveled, especially not at night." Joe left the diner feeling more unsettled than when he had arrived. The book's stories seemed to loom over him as he got back into his Freightliner. He tried the radio one more time. This time, it crackled to life, and a voice came through, distorted and barely audible. Joe Delaney," the voice said, but before he could respond, it was swallowed by static. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the fear that was creeping in. He had a job to do and couldn't afford to let his imagination get the best of him. He continued down the highway, the only light coming from his headlights slicing through the darkness. Hours passed, and the unease began to grow. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of life or civilization. Joe's eyes felt heavy, and he had to fight to stay awake. He had just started to doze off when he was jolted awake by a sudden, blinding flash of light. The road ahead was lit up like daylight, and the familiar swerving truck from earlier reappeared, hurtling toward him. Joe slammed on the brakes, but the truck continued to come closer, its headlights like a wall of light. Just as it seemed like a collision was imminent, the truck vanished, leaving Joe alone in the eerie silence. His heart pounded in his chest, and he struggled to catch his breath. In the distance, he saw something new, a dilapidated truck stop that had not been there before. Desperate for answers and an escape from the endless night, Joe pulled in. The truck stop was deserted, with broken pumps and a sagging roof. He got out, hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening. As he walked inside, he felt a chill run down his spine. The interior was frozen in time, with dusty magazines and old coffee cups. But what caught his eye was a large map pinned to the wall. It was marked with dozens of routes and highways, but there was one marked in red with a note that read, "Beware the lost road." Joe's blood ran cold as he realized that the road he had been on was the very one marked on the map. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the windows. Panic set in as the lights flickered and the temperature dropped. Shadows danced around him, and he could hear whispers, like distant voices calling his name. In the dim light, Joe saw something moving in the corner of the room, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was the driver of the phantom truck, his face obscured by a hood and his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The figure pointed toward a door that hadn't been there before. Joe ran, pushing through the door and out into the night. The road was still there, but it seemed different, less like a highway and more like a path into the unknown. He drove as fast as he could, the haunted shadows of the truck stopped fading behind him. As dawn began to break, the landscape changed, and the road seemed to straighten out. The radio crackled back to life, this time with clear, familiar voices. Joe finally reached a town, exhausted and shaken. He never spoke of that night again, and he avoided the route through Blackwood. But sometimes, when the night is still and the wind whispers through the trees, he can't help but remember the phantom trucker and the endless, haunting road. Joe Delaney hoped he had escaped the clutches of the phantom trucker, but the encounter left a lingering sense of dread that he couldn't shake. As days turned into weeks, he tried to put the experience behind him, returning to his normal routine and avoiding the remote highways that had so unnerved him. Yet, the shadows of that night seemed to follow him. He began to notice odd occurrences. The radio in his truck would occasionally crackle with static, even in areas where the signal was strong. Sometimes he would hear whispers through the noise, unintelligible but unmistakably eerie. Every time he saw an old rusted truck on the road, his heart would race, expecting it to be the phantom vehicle from that night. It wasn't long before Joe's paranoia began affecting his work. He was distracted and jumpy, often looking over his shoulder for signs of the supernatural. His dispatcher noticed the change in his demeanor and suggested a few days off to clear his mind. Taking the advice, Joe decided to visit his old friend Hank, who lived in a small town not too far from where he'd had the frightening encounter. Hank was a retired trucker, known for his tall tales and deep knowledge of the roads. If anyone could offer insight into Joe's experience, it was Hank. Joe arrived at Hank's house late in the afternoon. The old man greeted him with a firm handshake and a concerned look. "Been a while, Joe. You look like you've seen a ghost," Hank said, leading him inside. Joe chuckled weakly. "Maybe I have. I had a strange experience on the road a few weeks back. Thought I'd come by and get your take on it." Hank's eyes narrowed. He poured them both a glass of bourbon and gestured for Joe to sit. "I've heard my fair share of ghost stories from the road," Hank said, "but I've never seen anything myself, until now." Joe recounted the events of that night, the vanishing truck, the mysterious truck stop, the map marked with the lost road. As he spoke, Hank's face grew more somber. "That road you're talking about," Hank said slowly. "It's not just a ghost story. It's part of a local legend around here. There are places on the map that don't exist anymore, or never did. Some say they're gateways to places not meant for human eyes." Joe felt a shiver run down his spine. "But why? Why would something like that happen?" Hank took a deep sip from his glass. "There are stories about a trucker from the 70s who disappeared along that route. Some say he's still out there, seeking something he lost or trying to finish a job he started. Others believe he's trapped, unable to move on." Joe frowned. "But what does he want?" Hank shrugged. "No one knows for sure, but whatever it is, it's enough to keep him bound to that road. And if you find yourself on that road, he might think you're a part of it too." Joe spent the night at Hank's place, and although the old trucker's tales were unsettling, he felt a bit better having shared his experience. The next morning, Hank offered Joe a weathered book that detailed the legends of the highways and the strange occurrences reported by drivers over the years. Joe left Hank's house with a mixture of relief and unease. The book was filled with accounts of phantom vehicles, mysterious disappearances, and ghostly apparitions. He hoped that by understanding the history, he could prevent himself from becoming another tale in its pages. However, as Joe made his way back to the highway, he found that the unease never fully left him. He decided to take a different route home, avoiding the road that had been the site of his terrifying encounter. But as he drove, he noticed something strange. Every time he tried to avoid a particular route, the road seemed to bend back toward it, as if it was pulling him in. One night, while driving through a remote area, Joe saw a familiar sight, a dilapidated truck stop, almost identical to the one he had encountered before. This time, there was no mistaking it. The place was eerily familiar. He stopped the truck, feeling a sense of inevitability. He entered the truck stop, and to his surprise, it was not empty. The old woman from the previous encounter was behind the counter, her face worn with a knowing sadness. "I knew you'd be back," she said quietly, as though she had been expecting him. Joe's heart pounded. Why? Why is this happening? The woman sighed and slid a weathered photograph across the counter. It showed a young trucker, his face filled with a youthful grin, standing next to a shiny old truck. "This was him," she said softly. "The one who got lost on that road. His name was Jack. He's been trying to reach out ever since, searching for something he lost, something he never had the chance to find." Joe studied the photograph. The man's eyes seemed to follow him, filled with an intense longing. "How do I help him?" The woman's eyes were filled with tears. "You can't. No one can. The road is his prison, and all who wander there become part of his story." Joe felt a profound sadness. "Is there any way to avoid it?" The woman shook her head. "The road finds those who are meant to travel it. Sometimes the best you can do is to stay away and hope it forgets you." Joe left the truck stop with a heavy heart. He had learned the hard way that some places were beyond explanation, their mysteries intertwined with the fabric of reality in ways that defied understanding. The road, it seemed, was one such place, an endless loop of despair and longing. As he drove away, the familiar hum of the engine seemed to provide some comfort. The road stretched out before him, but Joe was determined to keep his distance from the haunted paths that lurked in the darkness. The phantom trucker's story would remain a cautionary tale, a reminder that some journeys were not meant to be taken and that some roads were better left untraveled. Joe returned to his usual routes, but the memory of that night never left him. Whenever he saw an old rusted truck or a lonely stretch of highway, he was reminded of the phantom trucker and the road that had tried to claim him. And though he drove on, the shadows of that night continued to linger, a haunting reminder of the road that never truly ends. Joe Delaney tried to move forward, returning to his usual routes and putting the haunting experience behind him. Yet, the shadow of that night seemed to follow him, lingering in his dreams and in the quiet moments of his day. Despite his efforts, it felt like the phantom trucker and the lost road were never too far from his thoughts. Several months later, Joe was assigned a new route that, by sheer coincidence or cruel twist of fate, included a section that led him close to Blackwood again. His heart sank when he saw the sign for Blackwood in the distance. He remembered the warnings from Hank and the old woman at the truck stop. Although he had been trying to avoid this area, it seemed the road had its own plans. Determined not to let fear dictate his actions, Joe resolved to complete the route and never return. As he drove through the twilight hours, the sky above was a deep shade of indigo, and the landscape seemed to be cloaked in an oppressive silence. The road appeared almost too still, like a forgotten memory waiting to be unearthed. He was nearing the edge of Blackwood when the radio crackled to life once more. This time, it was not static or distorted voices, but a series of chilling, intermittent messages that seemed to come from nowhere. The voices were familiar, echoing the whispers he had heard months ago, only now they were clearer, more insistent. Joe Delaney, you're so close." Joe's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced at the map Hank had given him, which he had kept for reference. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that it was nearly worn out. He followed the route as best he could, hoping to navigate through Blackwood without incident. Just as he crossed the familiar threshold into the town, a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring his view of the road ahead. The fog was thick and disorienting, wrapping around his truck like a suffocating shroud. Joe slowed down, trying to peer through the murk, but it was as though the fog was alive, shifting and swirling with a mind of its own. Then, without warning, the fog parted momentarily, revealing an old, dilapidated warehouse on the side of the road. Joe's heart skipped a beat. He recognized it from the photograph, the same warehouse from the ghostly tales Hank had mentioned. It was the place where Jack, the phantom trucker, had supposedly disappeared. Against his better judgment, Joe pulled over, driven by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. He stepped out of the truck, the cold fog clinging to his skin, and approached the warehouse. The building was decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the breeze. Joe hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The interior was dimly lit by the faint glow of a single hanging bulb. Dust particles danced in the air, illuminated by the light. The warehouse was filled with old crates, rusty tools, and forgotten relics. It felt like a place frozen in time. He wandered through the rows of discarded items until he came across an old desk with a faded ledger on top. The ledger's pages were yellowed with age, and as Joe flipped through them, he found detailed records of shipments and routes. Most of the entries were mundane, but one stood out. It was a log entry from the 1970s, detailing the last known trip of a trucker named Jack. The entry described Jack's final journey, how he had been hauling a mysterious cargo and had been instructed to make a stop at this very warehouse. The last few lines were smudged and hard to read, but one phrase was unmistakable: "Lost on the road. Can't find the way out." Joe's heart raced as he realized the significance of the entry. Jack had been trapped in this place, lost on a road that twisted and turned, forever ensnaring those who ventured too close. As he put the ledger down, Joe heard a noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the warehouse. He turned, and through the dim light, he saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Jack, the phantom trucker, his face hidden beneath a tattered cap. Joe's breath caught in his throat. The figure seemed to be trying to communicate, but the words were garbled, as though trapped between realms. Jack raised a hand, pointing toward an old truck parked in the corner of the warehouse. The truck was eerily similar to the one Joe had seen that night. Joe approached the truck, and as he got closer, he noticed something strange. The truck's dashboard was covered in dust, but there was a small, ornate box sitting on the passenger seat. He opened the box, and inside was a collection of old photographs and letters, all detailing Jack's life and his lost cargo. Among the items was a photograph of a young woman, with a note attached that read, "To my love, forever and always." The letters detailed Jack's longing to return home, to reunite with his loved ones, but he was doomed to roam the roads forever, unable to escape the cycle of torment. Joe's heart ached with empathy for the lost soul. He realized that Jack was not just a phantom but a tragic figure, bound to the road by an unfulfilled promise and a love that was never realized. Suddenly, the warehouse began to shake, and the fog outside seemed to intensify, swirling violently. The figure of Jack grew more distinct, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. Joe knew he had to act quickly. With a sense of urgency, Joe gathered the items from the truck and the ledger, hoping they might hold the key to breaking the curse. As he exited the warehouse, the fog seemed to lift slightly, revealing a faint path through the dense mist. Joe followed it, feeling an overwhelming sense of determination to help Jack find peace. The path led him back to the highway, and as he drove away from Blackwood, the fog began to dissipate. The road felt different, almost like a veil had been lifted. The radio crackled once more, but this time, the voice was clear and calm. "Thank you, Joe." Joe looked in the rearview mirror, but the figure was no longer there. The road ahead was open and clear, and he felt a profound sense of relief. The weight of the phantom trucker's story had been lifted, and the road seemed to have returned to its normal state. He never spoke of that night again, but he kept the ledger and the photographs as a reminder of the journey he had undertaken. The tales of Blackwood and the lost road faded into the background of his life, but they remained a part of him, a haunting reminder of the roads that sometimes led to the unknown. And as he continued his travels, he remained ever vigilant, knowing that some paths were best left untraveled, and some stories were better left as legends. 4:38 p.m., September 5, 2024. Syed Joe Delaney's return to normalcy was short-lived. Although he tried to forget the haunting experience in Blackwood, the memories lingered, and he often found himself unable to escape the shadow of that night. The experience had changed him, leaving him with a sense of unease that even the most mundane tasks couldn't dispel. His once steadfast confidence as a trucker had been replaced with a cautious apprehension, especially when driving through remote areas. One autumn evening, a few months after the incident at Blackwood, Joe was on a long-haul trip through Montana. The sun had set, and the highway was once again bathed in darkness, illuminated only by the headlights of his Freightliner. The landscape was a vast expanse of rolling hills and distant mountain ranges. The quiet hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of the wheels on the asphalt were the only sounds that filled the cab. As Joe drove, his thoughts drifted to the legends Hank had shared, and the memory of the phantom trucker began to resurface. He shook his head, trying to banish the thoughts. Just as he was about to switch on the radio to distract himself, he noticed a flicker of light in the distance. It was a solitary, dimly lit sign that read, "The Crossroads Inn," Joe frowned. He didn't remember any inns or stops on this route, and the sign seemed out of place in the otherwise desolate landscape. Curious and needing a break, he decided to pull over. The Crossroads Inn was an old, ramshackle establishment with a neon sign that buzzed sporadically. It seemed to be clinging to its last days, much like the warehouse in Blackwood. Joe pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The inn's interior was dimly lit and filled with the scent of stale cigarettes and old wood. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the warm glow was a stark contrast to the cold, dark night outside. The innkeeper was a tall, gaunt man with a tired, hollowed expression. His eyes were a striking shade of gray, almost reflective, as if they held secrets too heavy to share. He greeted Joe with a nod and a tired smile. "Evening. What brings you here?" the innkeeper asked, his voice as raspy as the crackling fire. Joe shrugged. "Just needed a break from the road. Didn't expect to find this place." The innkeeper nodded knowingly. "We're not on many maps. We exist in a place between places." Joe raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" The innkeeper's eyes flickered. "Some roads lead to places that are not on any map. Places that exist in the space between reality and the unknown." Joe felt a chill run down his spine. The innkeeper's words echoed the warnings he had received about Blackwood and the Lost Road. He decided to stay for the night, hoping that a good night's sleep might offer some clarity. He was given a room that was as worn out as the rest of the inn, with creaky floorboards and a threadbare rug. Exhausted, Joe collapsed onto the bed, but sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, haunted by fragmented dreams of shadowy figures and endless roads. In the dead of night, Joe was jolted awake by a noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the door. He sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. He got out of bed and opened the door, but the hallway was empty. The air was cold, and the inn seemed eerily quiet. As Joe stepped into the hallway, he noticed that the walls were lined with old black and white photographs. The photos depicted various scenes from the past: old trucks, faded landscapes, and people with hollow eyes. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It was a picture of the very warehouse from Blackwood, with a group of people standing in front of it. Among them was a man who looked remarkably like the phantom trucker Joe had seen. The rhythmic tapping continued, leading Joe down the hallway to a door at the end. He hesitated but felt an irresistible pull to investigate. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, a large antique mirror stood against the wall, its surface obscured by a thick layer of dust. Joe approached the mirror, and as he wiped away the dust, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The reflection showed not just the room, but also a figure standing behind him, a shadowy presence with glowing eyes and a look of profound sorrow. Spinning around, Joe found the room empty. His heart raced as he turned back to the mirror. The shadowy figure was now standing in the mirror, its expression a mix of anguish and resignation. It raised a hand, pointing directly at Joe, as if trying to communicate a desperate message. Joe stumbled back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure's eyes seemed to plead with him, and as he looked closer, he noticed that the reflection was not just showing the room, but also glimpses of other locations, roads, warehouses, and eerie landscapes, all blending together into a surreal, nightmarish vision. Desperate to escape, Joe turned and fled from the room, but as he raced through the inn, the walls seemed to shift and warp, leading him in circles. The once familiar corridors now twisted into a labyrinth, and the rhythmic tapping followed him, echoing through the hallways. Finally, he burst through the front door of the inn and into the cold night air. The Crossroads Inn loomed behind him, its windows dark and empty. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, swirling around him as he made his way back to his truck. As Joe drove away, the fog began to lift, and the road ahead seemed clearer. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the inn or the shadowy figure, but all he saw was the empty road stretching out behind him. Joe returned to his route, shaken but determined. The night's events had reinforced his belief that there were places on the road that were better left alone. The Crossroads Inn and its enigmatic innkeeper were added to the list of mysterious places he had encountered, a reminder of the thin veil separating reality from the unknown. Despite the unsettling experiences, Joe continued his work, but he approached each journey with newfound caution. He avoided the desolate roads and haunted places, sticking to familiar routes where the shadows of the past couldn't reach him. And as he drove through the miles, he kept his eyes on the road ahead, ever mindful of the paths that could lead to the unknown. Though he never spoke of his encounters again, the memory of the Crossroads Inn and the ghostly figure in the mirror remained with him, a haunting reminder of the roads less traveled and the secrets they held.